The echo of the Soviet war in Afghanistan remains sadly relevant. During the early days after the 9/11 attacks and the initiation of the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan, it was relatively common to reference the woeful Soviet experience in that country. Here was a clear paradigm of what not to do in order to avoid getting stuck in a quagmire. Surely, American leaders would be more adroit. By employing advanced U.S. technology along with a more sensitive effort to win hearts and minds, the Taliban, what was left of it, would be quickly vanquished. So much for that theory. But it might be worth exploring yet again some historical aspects of the Soviet war in Afghanistan, 1979 to 1989, in order to shed some light, not only on the present predicament of the American war in Afghanistan, now lamentably in its 16th year, but perhaps also to gain some insights into contemporary Russian foreign policy and society too. A detailed appraisal covering the military aspects of the Soviet war appeared in the mid-April 2018 issue of the Russian newspaper Nezavisimaya Gazeta to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the agreement on the 14th of April, 1988 to withdraw all Soviet forces from Afghanistan. The writer of this interesting piece is the rather conservative but quite independent-minded Russian defense analyst Alexander Kromshikin. The piece appears under the headline, "The Afghan Lesson for Russia, a collision with Islamic extremists was inevitable." The author explains that there was misperception back then on both sides concerning the origins of the war. He notes that the Soviet leadership was seriously convinced that American forces would invade Afghanistan in the near future, while Washington thought that Soviet forces were determined to drive all the way to the Persian Gulf in order to interfere with the transfer of oil supplies to the West. These assumptions were both completely wrong, of course, but Kromshikin says the assessment that the Americans got right was to seize the opportunity to arrange for the Soviets their own Vietnam. It is observed that the Soviet army was completely unprepared to fight a counterinsurgency war. It was a war without fronts and without a corresponding rear area. Contact with the enemy could occur at any time and in any place. Weapons and tactics had been designed for Central Europe or the Far East, but not for mountainous Central Asia, and all this led to many failures. Assaults against Ahmad Shah Massoud's partisan forces in the Panjshir Valley proved costly to Soviet forces again and again, because all of the operational plans were received by Massoud in advance. To be sure, the Soviet brass tried to rectify the situation by giving transport vehicles additional armor and making sure their swivel guns could fire almost vertically into the air to cope with ambushes in Afghanistan's innumerable narrow valleys. Yet, it seems to be an immutable fact of counterinsurgency warfare that the insurgents have superior intelligence and understand the ground better. The Soviets sought to innovate by developing a doctrine that focused on the use of helicopters and particularly the employment of special forces. Moreover, the new, main task was to be finding and interdicting convoys of arms coming from Pakistan. These strategic responses all sound familiar. There were some successes for Soviet forces. Kromshikin relates, for example, an episode at the end of 1984 when 220 partisans were killed in such an interdiction operation without losing any Soviet soldiers. But just a few months later, 29 Soviet Special Forces soldiers were killed in a single battle. During the year 1985, Soviet forces lost 18 aircraft and 53 helicopters, according to this analysis, and that was before the introduction of the Stinger shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles into the war. And that development, beginning in September 1986, caused a sharp increase in losses, especially with respect to helicopters. Despite such significant setbacks, Kromshikin claims that many thought that due to hard fighting in 1987 that the Soviet army could still completely win the war. In the end, Kromshikin concludes that the Kremlin could not sustain the war due to the economic catastrophe at home, but he also blames the advent of glasnost, which, he says, caused the Soviet society to turn actively against the war effort. He asserts that in this sense, the end of the Soviet war in Afghanistan was very similar to the end of the war in Vietnam. He describes the April 1988 agreement that ended the war as a complete and unconditional capitulation of the USSR, since he says that Washington and Islamabad did not even go through the motions of complying with their promises to stop aiding the partisans.